So let's have a bit of a look at the human cardiovascular system. First of all, here's a human heart. I'd like you to be able to know the location of these structures, so I listed them here. You can also, of course, use your textbook as a guide. There's a photo very much like this in your textbook already, so you may find it useful to study that. I will point out something cool, though. It's the blood hitting the atrioventricular valve and the closing of the semi-lunar valves that you hear when you hear a heart going lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. So something to keep in mind. But these are the terms that you should be able to label on the heart. All right, let's talk about blood flow. We've kind of talked about this already. I'm going to do it again. The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay? Then the pulmonary circuit takes place. The right ventricle pumps the oxygen-poor blood to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. Then diffusion takes place in the capillaries of the lungs, so that's at the alveoli. Blood returns to the heart via pulmonary veins to the left atrium. The left ventricle pumps blood to the body then via the aorta to body capillaries, and then blood returns to the right atrium via veins, where the process begins again. So this is the basic flow of blood, leaving out some of the parts, like some of the valves and things that you need to identify in the previous slide. The flow of blood through the human body. So you should be able to kind of list this out. Now let's look at a diagram so you can figure out what superior and inferior vena cava are and things like that. Okay. So here's a diagram of the human cardiovascular system. So let's start on the right side, the right ventricle, the right atrium. So blood is pressurized and it heads to the lungs in this branch here. When you have a vessel leading away from a heart, that's called an artery. So here we have oxygen-poor blood in the pulmonary artery heading to the lungs where it becomes oxygenated. It returns back to the lungs via the pulmonary veins. Then it goes into the left ventricle where it's pressurized again and it heads out. And it heads out via the aorta. See the word aorta there? That's the big artery leading out of the heart here. It branches. Some of it goes to the upper half of the body. Some of it goes to the lower half of the body. So up here we have diffusion of blood to the capillaries of the head and the arms and things like that. Down here to the abdomen and the hind limb, the limbs, the lower limbs, the legs and things like that. Blood then returns to the heart from the bottom via the inferior vena cava and from above via the superior vena cava. Okay? Back to the heart where it's then pressurized again and goes to the lungs. So that's the basic flow of blood through the human body. So a cardiac cycle is one complete circuit of the heart here. I should say complete sequence of pumping and refilling of the heart. And systolic pressure is the contraction phase, how much pressure the heart is exerting when it's on the blood when it's contracting, and then the relaxation phase is the diastolic pressure. So if you have your blood pressure taken and you see those two numbers, that's what it's recording. So it's whether your heart is contracting at the time the pressure was recorded, the pressure of the blood being forced, or kind of the resting period between beats of the heart. Now in that blood that is flowing through our veins, we have lots of red blood cells, which are weird because they don't really have nuclei. They're one of the few cells that don't, but they're loaded with this molecule here, which is hemoglobin. And it's composed of 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. In fact, one of these parts, the beta part, which might be this blue one here, I can't recall, is the part we compared among different organisms in that cladistics exercise I gave you in lab. We also have these hemigroups, which have an iron on them, and these are the parts of the molecule that for the most part carry oxygen. Iron binds to that oxygen. We already know that oxygen and iron get along. That's why things rust, right? And so This is what it looks like. It's kind of a ring with an iron in the middle. It's actually kind of similar, you can't see this very well, but it's kind of similar to the structure of chlorophyll. And it's this molecule that becomes misshapen if you have 2 copies of the sickle cell allele. And if the hemoglobin's misshapen, then it causes the whole red blood cell to be misshapen. And something I looked up the other day that you might find, sad and interesting, in parts of Africa where there's not a lot of medical attention available, the average life of someone with full-blown sickle cell, that means 2 copies, is like 5 years old. But here in the United States, it's in the mid 40s. Like 45, 46 is how old people with sickle cell anemia tend to live. They can live a lot longer with modern medicine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about physiology and kind of just brush against chemistry here. One thing that's really interesting about hemoglobin is that when blood pH is high, like a pH of 7.4, hemoglobin, we already know that pH and other things can change proteins and cause them to behave differently, right? And if you change them too much, they denature, they lose their shape. Well, hemoglobin at a pH of 7.4 has a high affinity for oxygen. So it sticks to oxygen really well at a high pH. But in a low pH, meaning an acidic situation, it loses the affinity for a lot of its oxygen, so the oxygen falls off, but it gains an affinity for CO2, carbon dioxide, which is cool because when there's lots of CO2 in your blood, it forms carbonic acid as it dissolves into the plasma of your blood, lowering the pH. So hemoglobin, when it hits that area full of carbon dioxide, releases oxygen, and then parts of that protein grab a hold of CO2 and carry it off and carry it to the lungs. So if we look at this curve, we can see pH and hemoglobin dissociation, and up here, O2 saturation of hemoglobin. So what can we learn by looking at this figure? Well, what we can see is that a pH of 7.4, okay, pH of 7.4 or so, that blood is able to hold on to more oxygen than at a lower concentration. So, or at a lower pH, I should say. So at a pH of 7.2, which is a little more acidic, it holds on to less oxygen. And when it releases that oxygen, it also grabs a hold of carbon dioxide. So the dotted line is pH 7.4. That's a high pH. pH 7.2 is that acidic environment, and we can see it holds on to less oxygen in that case. Now, let me go back to this. So that's important to understand. So, okay, so pretend you're at the hypercenter. You're working out. You're lifting weights. Your arm muscles are lifting weights, and they're producing lots of carbon dioxide because they're making ATP, and CO2 is a byproduct of that, right? That carbon dioxide goes into your interstitial fluid and then is picked up by your blood. So right there, right around the muscles that are exercising, your blood is very acidic. Well, 7.2 or so acidic. So the blood that comes from your heart hits those muscles, it encounters that CO2, it's going to dump oxygen off right there, which is great because your muscles need it because they're working out. They need oxygen as the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain to make more ATP. But also, the hemoglobin dumps that oxygen off and it becomes sticky to carbon dioxide, so it carries that CO2 away to the lungs where it can be exhaled. So this allows the body to dump oxygen off where it's most needed, but also to pick up CO2 at that same location and carry it away. Now, one problem with hemoglobin is that it also sticks to carbon monoxide, which is something that we produce when we have a furnace malfunction or we have a car parked in a garage or something that's running. Carbon monoxide is deadly, and here's why it's deadly. So first of all, I mentioned this once before, but your control center of your brain senses a change in pH, and that's when it tells you to breathe. When your pH, your blood pH goes down, that's when that urge to breathe kicks in, okay? And that has nothing to do with oxygen. Oxygen does not really change the pH of your blood, but carbon dioxide does. So if you're in a room full of carbon monoxide, it sticks to hemoglobin and it prevents oxygen from sticking to hemoglobin. So that's a problem. But you can still exhale carbon dioxide during this time. So your blood pH doesn't change. It doesn't become very acidic. So you don't have that panic, I'm choking feeling. And so you just get sleepy and die, or you could die anyway, if you're not rescued or if someone doesn't open the door and bring in fresh air, because you never have that panicky, I'm choking feeling because your blood pH stays at normal levels. That's why it's so deadly. Okay, so that is a run-through of the cardiovascular system. The next set of videos are going to pick up with the similar systems that we see in plants to talk about how they transport items through their bodies.